I was a pastor with a perfect life until my wife made an accusation that destroyed everything. Within hours, I went from preaching about God's love to being handcuffed and thrown into maximum security prison with the worst criminals in the country. They say the worst day of your life can become the best day of your life, depending on how you choose to see it. But let me tell you, when those cold metal handcuffs clicked around my wrists, and the officer read me my rights for a crime I didn't commit, when I heard the word rape attached to my name for the first time in my life, I thought my world was ending forever. I was a pastor, a man of God, someone who had dedicated his entire life to helping others, to spreading love and hope. And suddenly I was being arrested, accused of the most horrible thing you can imagine. The shame, the disbelief, the absolute terror of knowing that my entire life was about to be destroyed by a lie. It was more than my mind could handle. But what happened next, what God did in that darkest moment of my existence, that's the real story I need to tell you today. Because sometimes, friend, sometimes Jesus shows up strongest when everything else falls apart. You know, when people hear my story, they often tell me I should write a book. But honestly, I've always been the kind of person who uses humor to get through the heavy stuff. When things get too serious, too painful, I crack a joke. It's how I've learned to survive. Because if I had to relive every moment of suffering every time I tell this story, well, I think I'd just fall apart all over again. But today, I want to share my heart with you. Really share it. Because this story isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever felt lost. Everyone who's ever been accused of something terrible. Everyone who's wondered if God really exists when everything falls apart around them. I need to tell you where this all began, though. Because you can't understand the storm without knowing about the calm that came before it. I was born into what you might call a good Christian home. My mother gave birth to me in the hospital in Rio de Janeiro. But by the time I was 6 months old, we'd moved to a small town in the mountains of Minas Gerais. It was one of those places where everyone knows everyone, where the church bells ring every Sunday morning and people actually stop what they're doing to listen. My family had deep roots there. When my ancestors came from Germany generations ago, they helped build that little town from nothing. The streets were narrow and winding, the houses painted in soft colors that seemed to glow in the mountain light. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of place where children could run free and parents didn't worry. In a town like that, you were either Baptist, Catholic, or Presbyterian. There wasn't really a choice in the matter. You went to church the same way you went to school or work. It was just what you did. And my family, well, we'd been Presbyterian for generations, going all the way back to John Calvin himself, my grandmother used to say with pride. Now, let me explain what that means because it shaped everything about how I saw God and the world. See, back in 1517, a man named Martin Luther looked at the Catholic Church and said, "Something's not right here." He wrote down 95 things he disagreed with and nailed them to a church door. That was the start of what we call the Protestant Reformation. Luther started the Lutheran Church. But he had this student, this brilliant young man named John Calvin. Calvin agreed with most of what Luther taught, but he had his own ideas about how things should work. So he started what became the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church isn't like those charismatic churches you see today, where people speak in tongues and shout and dance in the aisles. Nothing wrong with that, mind you, but we were different. We were what you'd call traditional. We had a set time to start, a set time to end. We sang hymns from hymnals. The pastor wore a suit and tie. Everything was orderly, dignified. But here's what made us special. We believed in learning. Not just believing, but understanding. The Presbyterian Church is governed by a council, kind of like a democracy. The pastor doesn't have absolute power like a king. He's more like a prime minister, and he has to answer to the congregation. Every decision gets discussed, every dollar gets accounted for. I grew up in that world. I was in church before I could walk, singing hymns before I could read. And you know what? I loved it. I loved the smell of old hymnals and furniture polish. I loved the way the light came through the stained glass windows on Sunday mornings. I loved knowing that my great-great-grandfather had sat in those same pews, had sung those same songs. As I grew up, I did everything a good church boy should do. I helped clean the building. I arranged the chairs for services. I played triangle in the church band. Later, I learned piano. Then, I started singing solos. The old ladies would pat my head after church and tell my mother what a good boy I was. But it wasn't just going through the motions for me. I really believed. When I was alone in my room at night, I'd pray. Really pray. Not just God bless mom and dad, but deep conversations. I'd tell God about my dreams, my fears, my questions about life. I remember being maybe 12 or 13, lying in bed one night after a particularly moving church service. The pastor had preached about God having a plan for each of our lives. I stared at the ceiling and whispered, "God, what do you want me to do? What's my purpose?" At first, I thought maybe I'd be a veterinarian. I've always loved animals, still do. You should see my apartment now. It's like a jungle with all my plants. I can't walk past a stray dog without stopping to pet it. There's something about caring for God's creatures that just feels right to me. But as I got more involved in church, as I took on more responsibilities, people started telling me I had a calling. "Michael," they'd say. That's my name, by the way, Michael Henderson. "You've got the gift. You should consider ministry." By the time I was 16, I was doing things in church that most adults never get to do. I was elected as a deacon, which is a big deal in the Presbyterian church. A deacon is someone who takes care of the practical stuff, who makes sure the church is running the way it should. See, the Bible talks about taking care of widows and orphans, about helping people in need. That was my job. I'd visit the elderly members who couldn't get to church anymore. I'd help families who were struggling financially. I'd make sure the church's money was being spent the right way. The night they elected me, I was so nervous I could barely stand up when they called my name. The whole congregation voted, and when they announced the results, my mother started crying. I was the youngest deacon in the history of our denomination, worldwide, at 16 years old. But I had to wait until I was 18 to actually take the position. Church rules, you know. Those 2 years felt like forever. I spent them preparing, studying, learning from the older deacons about how to handle the responsibilities. When I finally took that oath of office, standing before the whole congregation with my hand on the Bible, I felt something I'd never felt before. It was like God Himself was placing His hand on my shoulder saying, "This is where you belong, son. This is what I made you for." As a deacon, I saw the heart of what the church really was. It wasn't just the Sunday morning services, the pretty hymns and polished sermons. It was Mrs. Patterson, 87 years old and alone, who needed someone to drive her to the doctor. It was the Thompson family, who lost everything when the father got laid off from the factory, and we helped pay their rent until he found work again. We had a drug rehabilitation center that the church supported completely. Every month I'd go visit the men there, guys my age and older who'd gotten caught up in addiction and were trying to get their lives back together. I'd sit with them, pray with them, sometimes just listen while they talked about their struggles. The church also helped support the local elementary school. This was a poor area, and the public school didn't have much. We'd provide supplies, help with repairs. Sometimes I'd go read to the kids. I loved those visits. Those children would look at you with such pure, trusting eyes. They believed the world was good, that grown-ups would take care of them, that everything would work out fine. I believed that too back then. My faith during those years was simple, strong, unshakable. I never doubted that God existed, never wondered if the Bible was true, never questioned whether I was doing the right thing with my life. The world made sense. Good people went to heaven, bad people went to hell, and if you followed Jesus, everything would work out in the end. I was so sure of myself, so confident in my calling. When people asked me what I wanted to do with my life, I'd tell them proudly, "I'm going to be a pastor. I'm going to serve God and help people." Looking back now, I see how innocent I was, how sheltered. I'd grown up in this beautiful little bubble where faith was easy, where the worst thing that ever happened was someone getting caught drinking beer behind the church. I thought I understood suffering because I'd visited sick people in the hospital. I thought I understood God because I'd read the Bible cover to cover 3 times. I had no idea what was coming. When I graduated high school, there was never any question about what I'd do next. I was going to seminary. I was going to study theology, learn Greek and Hebrew, become an expert in the scriptures. I was going to be the best pastor I could be. My parents were so proud. The whole church was proud. Here was their golden boy, their youngest deacon, going off to become a minister. They had a special service for me the Sunday before I left, prayed over me, blessed me, sent me off with such love and hope. I remember driving away from that little town for the first time in my life, watching the mountains disappear in my rearview mirror. I was excited, nervous, ready to take on the world for Jesus. I had my whole life planned out. Seminary, ordination, maybe come back and pastor the church where I grew up, maybe marry some sweet girl from the congregation, raise some kids, live happily ever after in service to the Lord. God must have been watching me drive away that day, knowing what lay ahead, and I wonder if he felt sorry for me. This eager young man with such simple faith, such clear ideas about right and wrong, such confidence that he understood how the world worked. Because seminary was about to change everything. When I got to the theological college, I threw myself into my studies like my life depended on it. I was determined to learn everything there was to know about God, about the Bible, about faith. I signed up for every class I could take: Greek, Hebrew, Latin, church history, systematic theology, biblical archaeology. I love the languages especially. There's something magical about reading the scriptures in the original tongues, seeing the nuances that get lost in translation. When you read the Greek New Testament, when you see the exact words that Matthew and Mark and Paul wrote, it's like touching the very breath of God. But something strange started happening in my classes. The professors, these men who were supposed to be pillars of faith, who had dedicated their lives to studying God's word, they seemed different than I expected. They'd teach us about the historical context of Scripture, about how different writers had different perspectives on the same events. They'd show us where manuscripts disagreed, where translations varied, where scholars debated the meaning of key passages. At first I found this fascinating. I wanted to understand everything, to dig deeper into the truth. But some of my classmates started getting troubled. "Professor," one would ask, "if there are all these differences, how do we know what's really true?" And the professor would shrug and say something like, "Well, that's the mystery of faith, isn't it?" I started noticing that several of my professors seemed to have lost something along the way. The more they studied, the more they questioned, the less certain they became about the basic truths of Christianity. Science had complicated their faith instead of strengthening it. But for me, it had the opposite effect. Every question they raised made me dig deeper. Every challenge to Scripture made me research harder. When they'd point out apparent contradictions in the Bible, I'd spend hours in the library, reading commentaries and historical texts, until I found explanations that satisfied me. See, I realized that what looks like contradiction is often just different perspectives on the same truth. If you and I both witnessed a car accident, we might describe it differently based on where we were standing, what caught our attention, what seemed important to us. That doesn't mean one of us is lying or wrong. It just means we're human beings with different viewpoints. The Bible works the same way. When Matthew tells the story of Jesus' birth differently than Luke does, it's not because one of them got it wrong. It's because they were writing for different audiences, emphasizing different aspects of the same miraculous event. Once I understood that principle, everything else started falling into place. The historical challenges, the archaeological questions, the scientific puzzles, they all had answers if you were willing to look hard enough and think carefully enough. Take the Old Testament laws, for instance. My professors would point to verses that seemed harsh or outdated and say, "How can we believe in a God who would command such things?" But when you understand the historical context, when you realize that God was essentially giving hygiene and safety rules to people living in tents in the desert 4,000 years ago, it all makes sense. The prohibition against eating pork? Pork is still one of the most dangerous meats to eat if it's not prepared properly. Trichinosis, parasites, all sorts of diseases that could kill you instantly in a time before antibiotics and proper medical care. The rules about women during menstruation? In a time before underwear, before sanitary products, before running water. A woman on her cycle could spread disease through an entire camp. God wasn't being cruel. He was being protective. The seemingly harsh punishments? When you're trying to establish the first organized society in human history, when people have been living in tribal chaos for generations, you need strong deterrents to establish order and safety. And here's the beautiful thing. When Jesus came, he said, "You've grown up now. You don't need these training wheels anymore. Now you can handle the real commandment, love God and love each other." The more I studied, the more amazed I became at how perfectly everything fit together. How every challenge to faith actually led to a deeper understanding of God's wisdom and love. When I graduated from seminary, the first thing I did was ask to teach at the college. I couldn't stand the thought of other young people losing their faith the way I'd seen so many of my classmates do. I wanted to show them what I'd learned. That doubt doesn't have to destroy faith. It can strengthen it. Those were good years, teaching years. I loved standing in front of a classroom full of eager young minds and walking them through the difficult passages, showing them how to wrestle with hard questions without losing their grip on truth. I felt like I was doing God's work, protecting the next generation of pastors from the doubts that had shipwrecked so many before them. But even then, Even in those confident days when I thought I had all the answers, God was preparing me for something I never saw coming. He was building my faith strong enough to survive what lay ahead. Because sometimes, the very thing that makes you strong becomes the thing that gets you into trouble. My reputation as a defender of the faith, my passion for truth, my unwillingness to back down from a fight, those qualities that made me a good teacher and a good pastor, they also made me someone who wasn't afraid to stand up when I saw something wrong. And in this broken world, standing up for what's right can be the most dangerous thing you can do. I need to tell you where this all began, though, because you can't understand the storm without knowing about the calm that came before it. I was born into what you might call a good Christian home. My mother gave birth to me in the hospital in Rio de Janeiro, but by the time I was 6 months old, we'd moved to a small town in the mountains of Minas Gerais. It was one of those places where everyone knows everyone, where the church bells ring every Sunday morning and people actually stop what they're doing to listen. My family had deep roots there. When my ancestors came from Germany generations ago, they helped build that little town from nothing. The streets were narrow and winding, the houses painted in soft colors that seemed to glow in the mountain light. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of place where children could run free and parents didn't worry. In a town like that, you were either Baptist, Catholic, or Presbyterian. There wasn't really a choice in the matter. You went to church the same way you went to school or work. It was just what you did. And my family, well, we'd been Presbyterian for generations. Going all the way back to John Calvin himself, my grandmother used to say with pride. Now let me explain what that means, because it shaped everything about how I saw God and the world. See, back in 1517, a man named Martin Luther looked at the Catholic Church and said, "Something's not right here." He wrote down 95 things he disagreed with and nailed them to a church door. That was the start of what we call the Protestant Reformation. Luther started the Lutheran Church, but he had this student, this brilliant young man named John Calvin. Calvin agreed with most of what Luther taught, but he had his own ideas about how things should work. So he started what became the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church isn't like those charismatic churches you see today, where people speak in tongues and shout and dance in the aisles. Nothing wrong with that, mind you. But we were different. We were what you'd call traditional. We had a set time to start, a set time to end. We sang hymns from hymnals. The pastor wore a suit and tie. Everything was orderly, dignified. But here's what made us special. We believed in learning, not just believing, but understanding. The Presbyterian Church is governed by a council, kind of like a democracy. The pastor doesn't have absolute power like a king. He's more like a prime minister, and he has to answer to the congregation. Every decision gets discussed. Every dollar gets accounted for. I grew up in that world. I was in church before I could walk, singing hymns before I could read. And you know what? I loved it. I loved the smell of old hymnals and furniture polish. I loved the way the light came through the stained glass windows on Sunday mornings. I loved knowing that my great-great-grandfather had sat in those same pews, had sung those same songs. When I graduated from seminary and started teaching at the theological college, I thought I had life figured out. I was the young professor who could answer any question, who could defend the faith against any challenge. I loved standing in front of those eager students, showing them how perfectly everything fit together, how every apparent contradiction in Scripture had a beautiful explanation. But God, He had other plans for me. He was about to take this comfortable academic faith of mine and throw it into the fire of real human suffering. You see, while I was teaching theology and living my neat, orderly life, I kept hearing about this place in Rio de Janeiro. People would whisper about it in hushed tones, this garbage dump where families actually lived. I'd grown up in the mountains, in that clean, safe little town where the worst poverty you'd see was maybe someone's roof needing repair. I had no idea what real desperation looked like. One day, I was driving through Duque de Caxias, near the Petrobras refinery, when I saw them. Families living in conditions that made my heart stop. I pulled over and walked closer, and what I found changed everything. It was a landfill, a massive garbage dump, and scattered across it were these makeshift shelters made of plastic sheets and scraps of metal. 400 families living there. 400 families calling this hellish place home. The smell hit me first. Rotting garbage, human waste, chemicals from the landfill creating this toxic fog that burned your eyes and throat. Then I saw the children, little ones running around barefoot in the filth, playing with broken toys they'd found in the trash. Their clothes were rags, their faces dirty, but their eyes, oh, their eyes were still bright with hope. There was no electricity, no running water, no bathrooms. Can you imagine that? 400 families sharing one bucket that served as a toilet. When it filled up, someone would carry it away and dump it. The floor of their homes wasn't floor at all. It was the liquid waste that leaked from the garbage, mixed with mud and rainwater. I stood there in my clean clothes, my comfortable shoes, looking at this scene from another world, and I felt something break inside my chest. How could this exist? How could families live like this in the same country where I worried about which car to buy? There were pigs and chickens running around, eating the same garbage these families sorted through, looking for anything they could sell. Rats the size of cats. The air was thick with flies and the constant smoke from burning trash. And in the middle of it all, children laughing, mothers trying to keep their babies clean, fathers working 16 hours a day picking through garbage to earn maybe $2. I went home that night and couldn't eat dinner. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those faces, kept smelling that smell. My comfortable life suddenly felt like a lie. Here I was, teaching people about God's love, about Jesus caring for the poor and the outcast, and I'd never even known places like this existed. The next weekend, I went back. I brought medicine, food, whatever I could carry. But I quickly realized that charity wasn't enough. These people needed more than handouts. They needed dignity. They needed hope. They needed someone to see them as human beings instead of just problems to be solved. I started spending every free moment I had there. I'd finish teaching my classes and drive straight to the landfill. I brought doctors and dentists to provide medical care. I helped families get identification documents so their children could go to school. I connected parents with job opportunities outside the dump, but the bureaucracy was overwhelming. You can't get a job without an ID. You can't get an ID without a birth certificate. You can't get a birth certificate without proof of address. And how do you prove your address when you live in a plastic shack on a garbage dump that isn't supposed to exist? I spent 4.5 years working in that place. 4.5 years watching families struggle, celebrating small victories, mourning setbacks. I saw children die from diseases that could have been prevented with clean water. I saw mothers prostitute themselves to buy food for their babies. I saw fathers break their backs sorting through toxic waste for pennies. And through it all, I kept asking God, why? Why do you allow this? Where are you in this suffering? It was during those years that my faith stopped being academic and became visceral, raw, real. I couldn't quote scripture to a mother whose baby was dying of diarrhea. I couldn't explain predestination to a father who hadn't eaten in 3 days. My theology had to become practical love, or it was worthless. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I quit my teaching job. I walked away from the security, the steady paycheck, the comfortable life, and decided to dedicate myself full-time to ministry. Not the kind of ministry where you stand behind a pulpit on Sunday mornings, but the kind where you get your hands dirty, where you smell like the people you're serving, where you can't tell the difference between your tears and theirs. My family thought I'd lost my mind. My colleagues said I was throwing away a promising career. But I knew, deep in my soul, that this was what God was calling me to do. This was where He wanted me to be. I remember the day I submitted my resignation letter. I sat in my car outside the seminary, holding that envelope, knowing that once I handed it in, there was no going back. I was choosing uncertainty, choosing to trust that God would provide for me the same way I was asking those families to trust that He would provide for them. When I finally walked into the dean's office and handed him that letter, he looked at me like I was crazy. "Michael," he said, "you have a gift for teaching. You could have a great future here. Why would you throw it all away for those people?" Those people. Even he couldn't see them as fully human. "Because," I told him, "Jesus didn't stay in the temple. He went to the tax collectors and prostitutes and lepers. If I'm going to follow Him, I need to go where He went." The years that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I was completely dependent on donations, on the kindness of churches and individuals who believed in the work. Some months I barely had enough to eat. Some nights I slept in my car because I couldn't afford a hotel room. But I was alive in a way I'd never been before. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities to see God work miracles in impossible situations. I watched families move out of the landfill into real homes. I saw children who'd never held a book learn to read. I witnessed addicts get clean, marriages get restored, hope return to eyes that had been dead for years. And I learned something profound about God during those years. He isn't the distant theological concept I'd studied in seminary. He's present in the most broken places, working through the most unlikely people. He shows up strongest when everything else falls apart. But it was also during this time that I started noticing things about myself that I'd never paid attention to before. Working so closely with people, seeing families struggle, watching marriages crumble under the pressure of poverty, I began to question everything I thought I knew about love, about relationships, about who I was supposed to be. I'd always followed the script, you know? Good Christian boy, seminary graduate, future pastor. I was supposed to find a nice Christian girl, get married, have children, live happily ever after serving the Lord. And I really tried to make that work. But there were moments, quiet moments when I was alone, when I'd catch myself thinking thoughts that scared me, feeling things that didn't fit the neat categories I'd been taught, looking at certain people in ways that made me question everything I'd been told about myself. I pushed those feelings down for years. I told myself they were just confusion, just the stress of the difficult work I was doing. I prayed for God to take them away, to make me normal, to help me be the man everyone expected me to be. And for a while, I thought maybe those prayers were working. I met someone, a wonderful woman who shared my heart for ministry. We got married, and I convinced myself that I was finally on the right path, finally living the life God intended for me. But you can't run from yourself forever. You can't pray away who you are. And eventually, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The marriage wasn't bad, not really. She was a good person, a kind person. But there was something missing, something fundamental that I couldn't name or understand. I felt like I was living someone else's life, playing a role that didn't fit. The stress of trying to be someone I wasn't, combined with the intense pressure of full-time ministry work, started taking its toll. I was exhausted all the time, emotionally drained, spiritually dry. I felt like a fraud standing in front of people talking about God's love when I couldn't even love myself honestly. And then everything started falling apart at once. The ministry work became more difficult as government regulations changed and funding dried up. The marriage became more strained as we both struggled to connect in ways that felt authentic. And deep inside, I was fighting a battle with myself that I couldn't talk to anyone about. I started having what I can only describe as dark thoughts, not about hurting anyone else, but about whether my life was worth living, whether the world would be better off without me, whether I was causing more harm than good by continuing to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd gotten so lost. Here I was, a man who dedicated his life to helping others find hope, and I couldn't find any hope for myself. During this time, I kept thinking about something that had haunted me since my seminary days. One of my professors had talked about quantum physics, about how the more scientists discovered about the universe, the more mysterious it became. He said that at the smallest level, particles behave in ways that seem impossible, existing in multiple states at once until they're observed. Maybe, he'd said, reality is far stranger and more complex than we imagine. Maybe there are dimensions we can't see, possibilities we can't comprehend. I found myself wondering if that was true about human identity too. Maybe we're more complex than the simple categories we've created. Maybe God made us with more variations, more possibilities than we've been willing to acknowledge. But these weren't the kinds of thoughts you could share in church. These weren't the kinds of questions you could ask in Bible study. So I carried them alone, feeling more isolated with each passing day. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was late at night, and I was sitting in my study, trying to prepare a sermon about God's faithfulness when your world falls apart. The irony wasn't lost on me. I answered the phone, and the voice on the other end was cold, official. "Is this Pastor Michael Henderson?" "Yes, this is Michael." "Sir, you need to come down to the police station immediately. We have some questions we need to ask you." My blood went cold. "Questions about what?" "Sir, you've been accused of sexual assault. We need you to come in for questioning." The phone slipped from my hand. The world tilted on its axis. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I was, it all crumbled in that moment. I sat there in my study, surrounded by theological books and sermon notes, and felt the presence of evil in a way I'd never experienced before. Not the abstract theological evil I'd studied, but something real and malicious that had come to destroy everything good in my life. And in that moment of absolute terror and confusion, when I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, I cried out to God with a desperation that came from the deepest part of my soul. "God, if you're real, if you're there, I need you now more than I've ever needed anything in my life. I don't understand what's happening. I don't know how to fight this, but I trust you. Even when nothing makes sense, I trust you." I didn't know it then, But that prayer, that moment of complete surrender in the face of impossible circumstances, that was the beginning of the most incredible journey of my life. Because sometimes, friend, sometimes Jesus shows up strongest when everything else falls apart. And he was about to show up in ways I never could have imagined. But before I tell you about that phone call and what happened next, I need to explain how I got to that point. Because the truth is, my life looked perfect from the outside. I was married to a wonderful woman who shared my calling. We had built something beautiful together, and everything seemed to be going exactly according to God's plan. Her name was Sarah, and when I first met her, I thought she was an answer to prayer. She was a missionary, passionate about serving God, with dreams of starting her own church. We met through mutual friends in 2012, and I remember the first time I saw her picture online, something in my heart just knew. This was different. This felt right. We were both careful people, both committed to doing things the right way. Our first date, we each brought a friend along, just to be safe. I asked our mutual friends for advice, and everyone said the same thing. She's a woman of God. You should pursue this. We dated for a year before getting married, and during that entire time we maintained complete purity. No intimacy, no crossing lines. It was hard, believe me. There were moments when the physical desire was almost overwhelming, times when we had to literally separate ourselves to avoid temptation. But we believed we were honoring God by waiting. The wedding was something else entirely. It was 2013, and somehow our ceremony became this viral sensation. The video was translated into 7 languages, viewed millions of times around the world. My declaration of love to her circled the globe. To this day, I get messages from people in other countries who were touched by our wedding. We went to Mexico for our honeymoon with 30,000 followers on social media. 7 days later, we came back with over 1 million. This was 2013, remember, when that kind of growth was unheard of. Suddenly, we weren't just a couple anymore. We were a brand. And I won't lie to you, the success was intoxicating. Book deals, speaking engagements, merchandise, everything you could imagine. We built what you could only call an empire. I'm talking about the kind of success where you don't look at price tags anymore, where you buy buildings instead of renting offices, where you have investments in multiple countries. Sarah was brilliant at business. She managed our careers, booked our events, handled the finances. We were partners in every sense of the word. I focused on the content, the speaking, the writing. She made sure we capitalized on every opportunity. For a few years, it felt like we were living a fairy tale. We had everything we'd ever dreamed of. A gorgeous home in the best neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. Cars, investments, respect in the Christian community, influence with young people around the world. But by 2016, something was starting to feel wrong. I found myself traveling constantly, sometimes not even remembering where I'd been. My assistant would tell me what to wear, where to go, what to eat. People would come up to me and say, "I saw you speak in such and such city," and I'd have no memory of being there. I was gaining weight, feeling disconnected from my own life. I realized I was being carried along by this massive machine we'd created, but I wasn't really living anymore. I was just a product being moved from one venue to another. That's when I decided to make some changes. I hired a personal trainer, started seeing a therapist, began taking better care of my health. For the first time in years, I wanted to invest in myself, not just in our joint projects. And that's when things started to shift in our relationship. Up until 2016, every major project we'd done had been about building her platform, her ministry, her dreams. Now I was saying I wanted to do some things for myself, write some books under my own name, develop my own ideas. Looking back now, I can see that this threatened her in ways I didn't understand at the time. Our entire financial empire was built on us being a team, a package deal. If I started developing my own separate identity, what would happen to everything we'd built together? 18 days before everything fell apart, she came to me with a proposal that should have been a red flag. She wanted to change our marriage from joint property to complete separation of assets. "Your family has a history of cancer," she said. "If something happens to you on one of your trips, if you get sick and die, your family will get half of everything we've built. That would leave me and the child with nothing. We should put everything in my name to protect us." I told her no. I said I'd write a will instead, make sure they were taken care of. But I wasn't going to change our entire marriage structure based on fear. Now I realized she was positioning herself for what was about to happen. The weekend before it all went down, I was traveling like always. Speaking in Sorocaba on Saturday, Campinas on Sunday. I drove all night because there wasn't a flight that would get me back in time for Sunday service. It was June 12th, 2016, Father's Day and Sarah's birthday, and I was exhausted but determined to be there for both celebrations. The church service is all on video. You can see me smiling, celebrating, presenting children for dedication, serving communion. Everything looked normal, perfect even. Monday, I noticed Sarah was acting strange. She had 2 friends at the house, which was unusual because we normally told each other when we were having guests. When I tried to talk to her, she was distant, cold. But I was coming off a week of travel, and I had business to catch up on. So I figured we'd talk when things settled down. Tuesday evening, I had dismissed all our employees for the day. The house was quiet. Sarah came into the living room where I was sitting on our gray sofa working on my laptop. "The child was violated," she said. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I jumped up immediately, my mind racing. Who? Where is he now? Is he in the hospital? What happened? And then she said the words that destroyed my world. "You're the one who did it." Friend, I can't describe to you the feeling that washed over me in that moment. It was like the ground opened up beneath my feet. Like reality itself stopped making sense. This woman I loved, this woman I'd built a life with, was accusing me of the most horrible thing imaginable. For a split second, I actually thought it might be some kind of joke. The accusation was so absurd, so completely removed from anything I could ever imagine doing, that my brain couldn't process it as real. But when I looked in her eyes, I saw that she was deadly serious. "What are you talking about?" I said. "That's impossible. I would never, could never," but she was already walking away. "I'm going to a hotel," she said. "I'll be back Friday. You have until then to think about what you're going to do." And just like that, she was gone. This woman who was my wife, my partner, my best friend, had just accused me of something monstrous and walked out the door like she was going to the grocery store. I sat there in that empty house, surrounded by all the beautiful things we'd accumulated, all the symbols of our success, and I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. My first instinct was to call the people who mentored her, friends of ours who lived in Dallas. I ran upstairs to my office and immediately got on my computer to reach out to them. "Something terrible is happening," I wrote. "Please try to contact Sarah. There's been a horrible misunderstanding." That conversation stayed open on my computer screen. Later, when the police seized all my electronics, it was the first thing they saw. The timestamp proved I was trying to get help, trying to figure out what was happening, not trying to cover anything up. But in that moment, sitting alone in my house, I was completely lost. I kept thinking Sarah must be having some kind of breakdown. Maybe she was being manipulated by someone. Maybe the stress of our lifestyle had finally gotten to her. Surely by morning she'd realize how crazy this was and come home. I noticed she'd left behind her bottles of prescription medication. She'd been taking anxiety medication for years, and I thought maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe she was having some kind of reaction, some kind of episode. I was so overwhelmed, so desperate to escape the nightmare my life had become in the space of one conversation, that I made a decision I'm not proud of. I took some of her medication, just wanting to sleep, wanting to stop the thoughts racing through my head. I left 2 notes before I did it. One for our employees, telling them I was taking something to help me sleep and not to wake me. Another for Sarah, telling her I loved her and could never do what she was accusing me of. What I didn't know was that this had all been planned for months. Our employees, people I thought were loyal to both of us, were actually longtime friends of hers from childhood. They'd known each other for over 20 years. They were part of whatever scheme was unfolding. When they found me the next morning, instead of just letting me sleep it off like the note said, they called an ambulance. At the hospital, one of them, my own driver, a man I'd trusted with my life countless times, kept unlocking my phone with my finger while I was still groggy from the medication. I remember him asking me to record messages, but I was so out of it I couldn't think clearly. Later, I found out he'd gotten me to say something about wanting to end the pain, and he'd sent that recording to people in my contacts. The hospital released me with a clean bill of health. "Patient is fully conscious and coherent," the report said. "Took medication only to sleep. No danger to himself or others." But the damage was already done. By the time I got home, the trap was already in motion. I spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief. I kept thinking Sarah would call, that this was all some terrible mistake that would get sorted out. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, couldn't focus on anything. Friday came and went. She didn't come home. Saturday, I was sitting in my study, trying to make sense of what was happening, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was official, cold. Is this Pastor Michael Henderson? Yes, this is Michael. Sir, you need to come down to the police station immediately. We have some questions we need to ask you. Questions about what? Sir, you've been accused of sexual assault. We need you to come in for questioning. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't Sarah having a breakdown. This was something much more calculated, much more devastating. I hung up the phone and sat there in my study, surrounded by my theological books and sermon notes, and I felt the presence of evil in a way I'd never experienced before. Not the abstract theological evil I'd studied and preached about, but something real and malicious that had come to destroy everything good in my life. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I was, it was all about to be taken away based on a lie, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. In that moment, I understood for the first time what it means to be truly helpless, to be at the mercy of forces beyond your control, to have your entire identity, your reputation, your future hanging by a thread that someone else was about to cut. I thought about all the people who would hear about this, the congregations I'd spoken to, the young people who looked up to me, the colleagues who respected me. I thought about my family, my mother back in our little mountain town. How do you explain something like this? How do you defend yourself against an accusation that's so heinous no one wants to hear your side of the story? I thought about ending it all right there, just finishing what I'd started with the medication a few days earlier. The thought of facing the humiliation, the trial, the destruction of everything I'd ever cared about, it seemed unbearable. But then, in that darkest moment, when I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. When you're at the end of your rope, that's when God ties a knot and tells you to hang on. I got down on my knees in that study, and I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. God, I said, I don't understand what's happening. I don't know why this is being allowed to happen, but I trust you. Even when nothing makes sense, even when everything looks hopeless, I trust you. Please, show me what to do. Show me how to get through this. I didn't hear an audible voice. I didn't see a vision. But something deep inside me, something stronger than fear, stronger than despair, told me to get up and face whatever was coming. Because God wasn't done with my story yet. And sometimes, friend, sometimes the darkest chapters are just setting the stage for the most incredible endings. That night, after that phone call from the police, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking Sarah would wake up the next morning and realize the terrible mistake she was making. Surely she'd call and say it was all a misunderstanding, that someone had been manipulating her, that we could work through whatever was happening. Even after everything that had occurred, I still had hope. I still believed in the woman I'd married, still thought there was some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. The next morning, I called a taxi to take me to the hospital. Not just any hospital, but the Samaritano or the Vittoria, the best private hospitals in Rio where my medical records were kept, where the doctors knew me. If I was going to get the medical clearance I needed to prove my mental stability, I wanted it from professionals who could vouch for my character. But when the taxi arrived, it was my driver, the same man who'd been working for us for years, who I'd trusted with my life countless times. Michael, he said, you don't need a taxi. I think you need more serious help. Let me call an ambulance. I should have been suspicious. I should have questioned why he was suddenly so concerned about my welfare, when he'd never shown that kind of care before. But I was emotionally exhausted, confused, and frankly grateful that someone seemed to be looking out for me. All right, I said, if you think that's best. The ambulance arrived, and they insisted I lie down on the stretcher. I didn't understand why, since I was perfectly capable of walking, but they said it was protocol. They strapped me in, and we began what should have been a familiar journey. I'd driven from my house to those hospitals probably 3 or 4 times a day for years. It was the route I took to get to most other places in the city. I knew every bump in the road, every traffic light, every pothole. So when the ambulance started bouncing and shaking like we were driving on a dirt road, I knew something was wrong. Where are we going? I asked the paramedic. Just taking a shortcut, he said. Heavy traffic today, but there are no dirt road shortcuts in Barra da Tijuca. We were going somewhere else entirely, somewhere far from the hospitals I'd requested. When I tried to sit up to look out the window, to see where we were headed, the paramedic immediately grabbed a syringe. Sir, you need to stay calm, he said. And before I could protest, he injected something into my arm. That's the last thing I remember clearly for 8 days. I woke up strapped to a metal bed in what I can only describe as a nightmare. I was in a small concrete cell, naked, with nothing but a thin gymnastics mat under my head. The walls were gray, stained, cold. There were no windows, just a harsh fluorescent light that never went off. My first thought was that I'd been kidnapped, that this was some kind of ransom situation, that someone would realize I was missing and come looking for me. I started shouting for help. "Someone call my office. Call my family. I've been taken. Help me!" But the only response I got was a man in scrubs who appeared at the small window in my door. "You're a very dangerous person," he said calmly. "Look at how agitated you're getting. This proves you need to be here." "Look up my name on the internet," I pleaded. "Look at my wedding video, my books, my speaking engagements. I'm not dangerous. I'm a pastor. Call my secretary, call my mother, call anyone who knows me." But every time I became emotional, every time I tried to explain who I was, they'd inject me with something that made me drowsy and disoriented. What I didn't know at the time was that I was in one of the most powerful psychiatric facilities in Brazil, a place with branches in every state, a place with a reputation for taking in wealthy patients and keeping them as long as profitable, a place where, statistically, someone died by their own hand every month. But here's the thing about being forcibly committed to a psychiatric facility. There are laws that are supposed to protect people. You can only be held for 72 hours without a court order. You need a doctor's recommendation after 24 hours of hospital observation. You need family consent or a court order for longer stays. None of that happened in my case. I'd only been in the regular hospital for 3 hours, and the doctor had declared me mentally stable. I had no court order, no family consent, no legal justification for being there. But there I was, day after day, trapped in a system that seemed designed to break people rather than heal them. The worst part wasn't the physical conditions, though those were terrible. The worst part was what they call gaslighting, psychological manipulation designed to make you question your own sanity. They put me in a section with patients who were completely disconnected from reality. People who screamed 24 hours a day, who had lost control of their bodily functions, who smeared waste on the walls. The staff would turn on a small, old television that was perpetually tuned to static, volume cranked to maximum, creating this constant, maddening noise. And while I lay there, cold, drugged, and confused, they had someone by my side constantly telling me I wasn't who I thought I was. "You're not Michael Henderson," they'd say. "You're a homeless man we found on the streets. We brought you here to save your life because you're a danger to yourself. You have no wife, no home, no career. That's all in your imagination." This went on hour after hour, day after day. Sleep deprivation, sensory overload, constant psychological pressure designed to break down my sense of identity. It's a technique that was developed during World War II, refined by intelligence agencies, perfected by people who understand how to shatter a human mind. But here's where God showed up in a way I never expected. In the depths of that hell, when everything around me was designed to make me forget who I was, I found myself clinging to the one thing they couldn't take away from me: Scripture. I started reciting Bible verses in my head, then quietly under my breath. Passages I'd memorized as a child, verses I'd studied in seminary, psalms I'd preached from hundreds of times. Those words became my lifeline, my connection to reality, my proof that I was still myself. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. When they told me I was a homeless man, I'd remember, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession." When they said I had no family, no life, no purpose, I'd recall, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Those scriptures were like a golden thread, connecting me to the truth about who I was. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. No matter how much they tried to convince me otherwise, no matter how disoriented the drugs made me, those words anchored me to reality. By the 7th day, something in me had broken, but not in the way they intended. I wasn't reciting scripture anymore. I was sitting quietly, apparently cooperating, cutting out little paper decorations for some craft project they'd given me. To them, I looked like I was finally accepting their version of reality. But inside, I was still fighting. Inside, I was still praying. On the 8th day, my mother found me. For over a week, my family had been searching desperately. When I didn't show up to my office, when I stopped responding to calls and messages, my secretary had contacted Sarah asking where I was. Sarah told her she'd killed me and hidden the body. Think about that for a moment. While I was being tortured in a psychiatric facility, my wife was telling people I was dead. My secretary didn't believe it, thankfully. She contacted my family in the mountains, people who barely understood how to use email, let alone navigate the complex medical system of Rio de Janeiro. My mother, this simple woman from a small town, came to the big city with nothing but the clothes on her back and a thermos of coffee. She spent days going from hospital to hospital, psychiatric facility to psychiatric facility, asking if anyone had seen her son. Most places turned her away, wouldn't even check their records. But she didn't give up. She couldn't give up. When she finally found the right facility, they initially refused to let her see me. The wife is the one who committed him, they said. Only she can authorize visits. But my mother wasn't taking no for an answer. She threatened to call the police, to contact the media, to do whatever it took to see her son. That's when the facility called Sarah and told her she had a problem. I was sitting in that craft room, cutting paper decorations like a good medicated patient, when they told me I had a visitor. For the first time in 8 days, an actual doctor appeared and said I was being taken to a consultation room. As we walked through the facility, I was amazed to see how beautiful it was outside of the punishment cells. There were gardens, recreational areas, nice rooms with windows. It looked like a resort. No one would ever suspect what happened in the hidden sections. But when I got to the consultation room, it wasn't a doctor waiting for me. It was Sarah, her lawyer, a pastor I didn't recognize, and the woman who'd been supervising my psychological torture. "Sarah," I said, overcome with relief. "Thank God you're here. There's been a terrible mistake. I don't know what's been happening, but we need to get me out of here." For a moment, seeing her familiar face, I thought maybe this nightmare was finally over. Maybe she'd realized the horrible error that had been made and had come to rescue me. But the lawyer immediately stepped between us. "You cannot approach her," he said. "You cannot speak directly to her. We have a restraining order against you." Then he handed me a document. "This is an annulment petition. You need to sign it, stating that you never consummated your marriage, that you've been celibate your entire life and plan to remain celibate forever." I stared at the papers, confused. They wanted me to lie, to say our marriage had never been real, that we'd never been intimate during our 3 years together. "This will support her story that you've never had sexual relations with anyone," the lawyer explained. "It protects her narrative. Of course, if I ever tried to have a relationship with anyone else, if any woman ever became pregnant, it would contradict their claim that I was someone who never engaged in intimate relationships. They were trying to lock me into a box that would support their story forever." But in that moment, broken as I was by 8 days of psychological torture, I still loved her. I still believed there was some way to save our marriage. "I won't sign it," I said. "I love this woman. Whatever's happened, whatever's gone wrong, we can fix it. We can get help, go to therapy, work through this together. I was made for this woman." I looked directly at Sarah, hoping to see some flicker of the person I'd married, some sign that she remembered the love we'd shared. She looked back at me coldly and said, "I forgive you." Then she stood up and walked out of the room. As she left, I heard her say to the staff, "You can release him now." That's when my mother was finally allowed to see me. When I saw her face, I broke down completely. I started crying like a 5-year-old child, calling out, "Mama, Mama," over and over again. This woman who'd driven hundreds of miles, who'd searched for days, who'd refused to give up even when everyone told her I was probably dead. She took one look at me and started sobbing too. My mother, who never cries, who never talks about painful things, completely broke down. "Let's get out of here," she whispered. But when we tried to leave, I realized the full scope of what had been done to me. I had a restraining order that prevented me from going to my house, my office, or any of the places where I'd built my life. I had no identification, no money, no possessions. Everything had been taken. One of my former employees, the secretary who'd helped my mother find me, lent us a small 1-bedroom apartment. It was all she could afford, but it was somewhere for me to sleep while we tried to figure out what to do next. That's when I discovered there was a warrant out for my arrest. A friend who'd been trying to help called and said, "Michael, I looked you up in the court system. There's an arrest warrant issued for you." I called the lawyer who'd supposedly been representing both Sarah and me. "I can't defend you," he said. "Since I was her lawyer too, the ethics board won't allow it. But I'll recommend someone. You can pay him after you win your case." His friend came to see me and laid out the situation. "We need to turn you in," he said. "Running won't help your case." Here's what had happened. Sarah had walked into a police station and simply declared that her stepchild had been abused. No investigation, no evidence, no witness statements, no medical examination. The detective wrote a 1-page report to the judge saying I was extremely dangerous and needed to be arrested immediately. The judge, trusting the detective's word, signed the arrest warrant. No inquiry, no due process, no consideration of the fact that I was a first-time offender with a fixed address, a public schedule, and no history of violence whatsoever. So there I was, walking into a police station to surrender myself for a crime I didn't commit, based on an accusation with no supporting evidence, processed by a system that had already decided I was guilty. They handcuffed my hands and feet before I even understood what was happening. They took my glasses, my shoelaces, anything that could theoretically be used as a weapon. High security risk, they kept saying, as if I were some kind of terrorist instead of a pastor who'd voluntarily turned himself in. They wouldn't even give me utensils to eat with. I had to eat with my hands, like an animal. When my lawyer tried to file for immediate release, it was too late. I was already being transferred to Bangu, the maximum security prison where they house the most dangerous criminals in Rio de Janeiro. Gang leaders, murderers, the worst of the worst. And here I was, a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong people, being transported there in a police van with sirens blaring, paraded through the city like I was some kind of monster. In the van, there were about 15 other prisoners. The conversation was always the same. "What are you in for?" "Didn't pay child support," was the standard answer. Nobody wanted to admit to their real crimes. When they asked me, I said the same thing. Didn't pay child support. Because how do you tell a van full of hardened criminals that you're accused of harming a child when you're innocent? How do you explain that your life was destroyed by a lie when nobody would believe you anyway? The whole ride I kept thinking my lawyer would come through, that someone would realize this was all a terrible mistake, that I'd be released before we reached the prison. But as we pulled through those massive gates, as I saw the guard towers and razor wire, I realized this was real. This was happening, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. They paraded me through Rio de Janeiro with sirens blaring, a public spectacle designed to humiliate and shame. The noise was overwhelming, triggering some kind of trauma response from my time in the psychiatric facility. Even now, years later, loud sirens still affect me. When we arrived at Bangu, they processed me like any other criminal, stripped me naked, shaved my head, took my fingerprints and photos. And here's something strange that happened. I'd been redheaded my entire life, born with red hair, just like several people in my family. But the trauma I'd been through was so severe that when they shaved my head and my hair grew back, it was completely different. Dark brown instead of red. Even my body was trying to become someone else. In the intake area, surrounded by guards and other prisoners, they asked me a question I didn't understand. "What's your article?" I thought they were asking about grammar. "Article? You mean like definite or indefinite?" They looked at me like I was crazy. In prison slang, article means what crime you're charged with. But I had no idea. When I didn't answer properly, they decided I was being disrespectful. And that's when the real nightmare began. They have techniques for punishment that don't leave visible marks. Ways to cause tremendous pain without creating evidence of abuse. I won't describe exactly how they do it, but let me just say that you can be seriously injured internally without anyone being able to prove what happened to you. Then came the question that every new prisoner dreads. Are you Red or are you Third Command? These are the two major prison gangs in Rio de Janeiro. You have to choose a side, or you become a target for both. But I wasn't a criminal. I didn't understand the politics, the allegiances, the unwritten rules that govern life behind bars. "I'm nothing," I said. "I'm a pastor." Wrong answer. In prison, there's no such thing as neutrality. There's no such thing as being innocent until proven guilty. There's only survival. And survival depends on understanding a system I'd never been exposed to in my entire life. As they dragged me toward my cell, as I heard the sounds of violence and desperation echoing through those concrete corridors, I realized that everything I'd thought I knew about justice, about protection under the law, about human decency, had been an illusion. I was about to learn what it really means to be powerless, to be at the mercy of people who see you as less than human. But even in that moment, even as they threw me into a world I never could have imagined, there was something deep inside me that refused to break completely. Maybe it was all those years of studying scripture. Maybe it was my grandmother's faith, passed down through generations. Maybe it was just the stubborn conviction that God doesn't abandon his children, even in the darkest places. Because, friend, sometimes the valley of the shadow of death is exactly where you discover that you're not walking alone. What happened next in that prison still gives me chills when I think about it. Not because of the horror of it, though that was real enough, but because of how God showed up in the most unexpected way. The guards who processed me, I can still see their faces clearly. I can still hear the sound of their boots on the concrete floor as they dragged me, naked and beaten, toward the cells. There are corridors in that prison labeled A, B, C, D, E, and F. A is the best section. F is the worst. They threw me into section F. The cell they put me in didn't even have a roof anymore. It was overcrowded with other prisoners. No running water, no proper food, insects everywhere, unbearable heat during the day and bitter cold at night. The smell was indescribable, human waste and decay and desperation all mixed together. As they shoved me through the cell door, those two guards, their faces burned into my memory forever, said something that made my blood freeze. "Listen up," they announced to the other prisoners. "This one's a child molester. Whoever gets to him first, we won't punish you for it." When I heard that cell door slam behind me, when I realized I was trapped in a room full of violent criminals who'd just been given permission to do whatever they wanted to me, I closed my eyes and said the same words Jesus said on the cross. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." I was certain my life was about to end in that moment. I only prayed for one thing. Please, God, let it be quick. I found a corner, curled up naked in a fetal position, and waited for the inevitable. But then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Instead of violence, I felt someone gently touching my shoulder. When I looked up, expecting to see hatred or cruelty, I saw a man holding out a pair of shorts. Another prisoner handed me a white t-shirt. A third gave me a pair of black flip-flops that I still have to this day. And for the next 7 days, not one of those men looked me in the eye. Every time they spoke to me, they kept their heads down, their voices respectful, almost reverent. Friend, I need you to understand something. I've researched what happens to people accused of crimes against children when they're thrown into general population. Most don't survive 24 hours. Those who do are tortured, brutalized, often killed within days. But these men, hardened criminals who'd committed every kind of violence you can imagine, they protected me. They fed me when the guards let my food rot before bringing it to me. They watched over me like I was their own family member. This was humanly impossible. There's no explanation for it except divine intervention. While I was experiencing this miraculous protection inside those walls, outside the prison, my life was being completely destroyed by a media campaign that had already decided I was guilty. Sarah was orchestrating a masterpiece of manipulation. She took over all my social media accounts and began posting things designed to make me look like a monster. She found photos of me jogging on the beach at night, wearing a hood to stay warm, and claimed they were evidence of satanic rituals I was participating in. She went on television shows, sat before senators who used their platforms to call for my death or life imprisonment. She was perfectly made up, hairstyled, professional film crew capturing every tear, every dramatic pause as she talked about how her life had been destroyed by the monster she'd married. And I had no way to defend myself. No access to lawyers who could afford to take on such a high-profile case. No money to pay for representation. No voice to tell my side of the story. But here's the thing that would later prove everything. Just 2 days after Sarah made her accusations, the child was examined by forensic specialists from the prosecutor's office. These are professionals who do nothing but investigate these kinds of cases. People trained to detect deception and uncover truth. Their report was unambiguous. The child had lied at the mother's request. There was no evidence of any abuse, no physical signs, no psychological indicators. The trained experts concluded that the accusation was fabricated. Even with that report in hand, I remained in prison, tortured and humiliated, while the media circus continued for months. After 7 days in that hellish cell, my lawyer finally managed to get an emergency hearing. The judge granted habeas corpus, and I was released pending trial. But when I walked out of those prison gates, there was a mob waiting for me. Reporters, cameras, and crowds of people who wanted to tear me apart with their bare hands. My lawyer had hired security guards, thank God, because without them I probably wouldn't have survived my first day of freedom. Even then, I still believed in Sarah. Even after everything that had happened, I thought maybe she'd realize her mistake. Maybe someone had been manipulating her. Maybe we could still work things out. It took me almost a year to accept what a friend finally had the courage to tell me. She's not confused, Michael. She's not being manipulated. She's evil, and she did this on purpose. Everyone knows it, but nobody has the courage to say it. Even when I started to see the timeline, how she'd tried to change our marriage contract 18 days before the accusations, how the employees who betrayed me had been her childhood friends for over 20 years, how every detail had been planned months in advance, part of me still couldn't accept it. You have to understand, my mind wasn't working properly anymore. The trauma of the psychiatric facility, the prison, the public humiliation, it had broken something fundamental in my ability to process information. Before all this happened, my brain was like a computer. I could work on multiple projects simultaneously, read 3 books at once, memorize entire speeches, and deliver them flawlessly. After the trauma, I couldn't read a single sentence without forgetting what I'd just read. I'd start a word and forget how to finish it. For 3 years, I lived under court-ordered restrictions. I couldn't leave my tiny borrowed apartment without permission. I had to check in with the court monthly to prove I hadn't fled. I couldn't go anywhere Sarah might be present, which meant most of the city was off-limits to me. My body began to shut down from the stress and isolation. My muscles atrophied as if I'd been in a coma. I developed physical deformities from the beatings I'd received that I'm still trying to treat today. Sometimes one side of my face is more swollen than the other, and I have to undergo painful procedures without anesthesia to try to repair the damage. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. The worst part was the silence from God. For 30 years, I'd had an intimate relationship with the divine. My prayers were never formal or religious. I'd talk to God like a friend, like a father sitting down for a conversation. "Dad, sit here, let's chat," I'd say. And I always felt his presence, his guidance, his love. During those 3 years, that voice went completely silent. I'd pray and hear nothing. I'd cry out in desperation and get no response. I'd beg for just a sign, just a whisper, just something to let me know I wasn't completely alone, and the heavens seemed closed to me. That silence made me angrier than anything else that had happened. I'd challenge God directly. "They're calling me a Satanist, but you're the one who's abandoned me. Maybe I should just live up to their expectations. Everyone's going to think I'm guilty anyway." But even in my darkest moments, something deep inside wouldn't let me break the covenant I'd made with him. The God I'd grown up loving wasn't the distant bureaucratic deity of organized religion. He was personal, intimate, real, and even though I couldn't hear his voice, somehow I knew he was still there. Meanwhile, Sarah was building a fortune on her victim narrative. She wrote 2 books about her tragic experience with a monster. She tripled her speaking fees, became the darling of talk shows and women's conferences. While I was hiding in poverty, forgotten by the world, she was becoming rich and famous off the lie that destroyed my life. The legal process moved with agonizing slowness. For 3.5 years, I lived in limbo, neither convicted nor cleared, unable to rebuild my life or move forward in any meaningful way. But my lawyer, God bless him, was more than just legal counsel. He was a caretaker, making sure I had psychological support, checking on my mental health, treating me like a human being when the rest of the world saw me as a monster. And the prosecutors who were supposed to be trying to convict me did something unprecedented in Rio de Janeiro's legal history. They wrote a 57-page defense of the accused, systematically dismantling every aspect of the case against me. These weren't defense attorneys. These were the people whose job it was to prove my guilt. But as they investigated deeper, as they interviewed witnesses and examined evidence, they realized they were looking at an elaborate frame-up. In their final recommendation, they didn't just ask for my acquittal. They requested that Sarah be investigated for filing false charges and orchestrating a criminal conspiracy. When the day finally came for my hearing, I was terrified. The lead prosecutor was ruthless in her questioning, firing questions at me like bullets, trying to find any crack in my story, any inconsistency that might indicate guilt. "How many times did you have intimate relations with your wife per week?" she demanded. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Depends on the week. Sometimes I was traveling. Sometimes we were both busy. Maybe 3 times some weeks. Maybe none others." "Is that normal?" she pressed. "I don't know what normal is. I'm not married to anyone else. I can only tell you what our experience was." The judge later wrote in his decision that I showed total sobriety and transparency in answering questions, that I never tried to manipulate my image or use tricks to appear more sympathetic, which is common among defendants. That's because I'd made a decision going into that courtroom. I was going to tell the absolute truth, no matter what. If I started lying about small things, I'd get confused. I'd contradict myself. I'd lose track of what was real. When the verdict came down, it was unanimous. Complete acquittal on all charges. The judge's written decision was so thorough, so clear in establishing my innocence, that I want to frame it and hang it on my wall. But when I tried to celebrate, when I tried to stand up and rejoice in my vindication, I discovered that my body had given out completely. I couldn't stand without help. 3.5 years of stress and trauma had left me physically broken, unable to even take a victory photo without assistance. The media that had crucified me barely covered my acquittal. The headlines that had screamed about my guilt whispered about my innocence. Sarah's story began to fall apart as more details emerged. But by then, she'd already made her fortune and moved on to her next chapter. And me? I was free. But I was also destroyed. Financially ruined, physically damaged, psychologically scarred, spiritually empty. I'd proven my innocence, but I couldn't get my life back. I couldn't undo the damage to my reputation, couldn't recover the relationships that had been lost, couldn't restore the ministry that had been my calling. Standing there in that courtroom, vindicated but broken, I realized that winning wasn't the same as healing. Justice wasn't the same as restoration. I was free, but I still had no idea who I was supposed to be now, or how to rebuild a life from the ashes of everything I'd lost. Little did I know that God was about to begin the most incredible chapter of my story, that everything I'd been through, every moment of suffering and doubt and despair, had been preparing me for a journey of discovery that would change not just my life, but my understanding of who He created me to be. Sometimes, friend, you have to lose everything you thought you wanted before you can find everything you actually need. Even after I won in the first court, my nightmare was far from over. I was so physically weak, so broken down by 3 years of trauma, that I couldn't even properly celebrate my vindication. The media barely noticed the verdict because I was too frail to make any kind of public statement. For 3 more years, I lived in a different kind of prison. Sarah filed motion after motion trying to get me arrested again. 28 times she went to court with new accusations, new complaints, new attempts to destroy what little life I had left. She'd claim I violated the restraining order because someone liked a comment that mentioned me. She'd invoke domestic violence laws against me for giving interviews she didn't approve of. Every single day for 3 years, I woke up at 5 in the morning in a state of panic, because that's when police raids happen. Every single day, I checked the court website obsessively to see if there were new charges against me, new reasons why I might be dragged back to that hell. I had no peace, no rest, no moment when I could truly breathe free. But it was during this period that God began to speak to me again, not in the way I expected, but in a way that would change everything about how I understood His love. I remember the exact moment when everything shifted. I was sitting in that tiny borrowed apartment, reading another court filing where Sarah was demanding my imprisonment, feeling the familiar rage and helplessness rising in my chest. And suddenly, I heard a voice in my heart, clear as day. Forgive her. No, I said out loud. Absolutely not. After everything she's done, everything she's put me through, forgiveness is too much to ask. But the voice came again, gentler this time. Forgive her. Not for her sake, but for yours. Forgiveness isn't about saying what she did was okay. It's about refusing to let her actions continue to poison your life. That began the hardest spiritual battle I've ever fought. Every day I would pray, God, I hate this woman with every fiber of my being, but I choose to forgive her in Jesus' name. I choose to release this anger because it's killing me. It wasn't a feeling. It was a decision I made over and over again, sometimes minute by minute, until slowly, gradually, the hatred began to lose its grip on my heart. And here's the miracle. When I finally, truly forgave her, she stopped being able to hurt me. Not because she stopped trying, but because her actions no longer had power over my emotions, my peace, my sense of self-worth. When I stopped being her victim in my own mind, I started getting strong again. Last year, the appeals court rendered its final verdict. Unanimous acquittal on all charges. Not only did they uphold my innocence, but they commended the thoroughness of the investigation that exposed the conspiracy against me. When my lawyer called with the news, I was strong enough to celebrate. I screamed with joy. I went live on social media, and within 24 hours I was back in every newspaper, every blog, every major media outlet in the country. But this time, the story was different. This time, I was the hero, not the villain. This time, people were apologizing for believing the lies, for participating in my destruction without knowing the facts. For about a month, I was Brazil's sweetheart again. The wrongly accused man who'd survived hell and come back to tell the story. Book deals, speaking engagements, endorsement opportunities, everything I'd lost was being offered back to me. And that's when I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew me. I decided to tell the truth about who I really am. You see, during those years of trauma and recovery, While I was rebuilding my relationship with God and learning to forgive, I was also discovering things about myself that I'd been hiding my entire life. Working so closely with people, seeing families struggle, watching marriages crumble, witnessing the full spectrum of human experience, I began to understand that love comes in many forms. That the God who created infinite diversity in nature had also created infinite diversity in the human heart. I started having feelings, attractions, connections that didn't fit the neat categories I'd been taught growing up. And for the first time in my life, instead of praying for those feelings to go away, I prayed for wisdom to understand what God was teaching me through them. 1 month ago, I announced publicly that I'm in a relationship with a man. That after 30 years of trying to fit into a box that wasn't made for me, I've finally found the courage to live authentically. The reaction was swift and predictable. The same people who'd celebrated my vindication turned on me overnight. The death threats started again. The accusations that Sarah had been right all along, that I'd somehow bought off the entire Brazilian justice system, that my acquittal was all an elaborate cover-up. But here's the beautiful irony. The people who are attacking me now are mostly the same ones who claim to follow Jesus. The ones posting, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," in their profiles while sending me messages saying they hope I die. The secular world, the non-believers, the people who don't claim to have God figured out, they've been overwhelmingly supportive. They understand that love is love, that authenticity takes courage, that judging someone else's journey is not their job. When I called my mother to tell her, I was terrified. This woman who'd fought for me, who'd saved my life, who'd never given up hope when everyone else thought I was dead. What would she think of this final revelation? There was a long silence on the phone. 30 minutes that felt like 30 years. Finally, she said, "Son, you know I don't necessarily agree with this choice. And you know that in our small town, people are going to talk. But you're my child, and I love you no matter what." It wasn't the enthusiastic acceptance I'd hoped for, but it was love. Real, unconditional, mother's love that doesn't depend on whether you meet all the expectations. My brothers were even more supportive. "After everything you've been through," one of them said, "if you wanted to marry a telephone pole, I'd be honored to walk that pole down the aisle. Nothing changes how much I love you." But the attacks from the religious community have been brutal. They call me names I won't repeat. They say Sarah was right about everything. They demand I get down on my knees and beg her forgiveness. What they don't understand is that I spent years begging God to make me different, to take away the parts of myself that didn't fit their expectations. What I discovered is that God doesn't want me to be someone else. He wants me to be the fullest, most authentic version of who He created me to be. The Jesus I serve isn't the narrow-minded, judgmental deity of organized religion. He's the one who ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, who defended the woman caught in adultery, who said the greatest commandments are to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. I'm not asking anyone to agree with my choices. I'm not asking for approval or validation. I'm simply choosing to live honestly, to stop hiding, to stop pretending to be someone I'm not just to make other people comfortable. Because here's what I learned in that prison cell, in that psychiatric ward, in those dark years when I thought God had abandoned me. The only thing worse than being hated for who you are is being loved for who you're not. Today, I'm pursuing legal action against the state that imprisoned and tortured me without due process. I'm suing the psychiatric facility that held me illegally and tried to break my mind. I'm seeking justice against the people who participated in destroying my life based on lies. Some people ask me, if you've really forgiven her, why are you still fighting in court? The answer is simple. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting evil continue unchecked. I wasn't her first victim, and if I do nothing, I won't be her last. Justice isn't revenge. It's protection for future victims. I've forgiven her completely, released all personal hatred and desire for vengeance. But love demands that I try to prevent her from doing to someone else what she did to me. I live with some precautions now. I don't publish my address. I use a P.O. box for mail. I try not to travel alone. There are still people out there who believe Sarah's version of events, who think they'd be doing God a favor by silencing me permanently. But I'm not afraid anymore. What can they do to me that hasn't already been done? They've taken my money, destroyed my reputation, thrown me in prison, tortured my body and mind, separated me from my family and friends. I've survived it all, and I'm still here. More than that, I'm thriving. I'm writing again, speaking again, connecting with people who understand that God's love is bigger than human prejudice. My audience may be smaller now, but it's more authentic. The people who follow me today love me for who I am, not for who they want me to be. And you know what the most incredible part is? I'm happier now, living honestly and facing persecution, than I ever was when I was trying to be someone else's version of perfect. Because I finally understand what Jesus meant when he said, "The truth will set you free." It's not the truth about theology or doctrine or religious rules. It's the truth about who you are, who God made you to be, and the courage to live that truth no matter what the cost. I spent 30 years in a beautiful prison of other people's expectations. The real prison? The one with concrete walls and steel bars. That was just the physical manifestation of the cage I'd been building around my own heart my whole life. God didn't rescue me from prison to put me back in a different cage. He rescued me to set me free, completely free, to be exactly who he created me to be. And friend, if you're listening to this story and you're hiding parts of yourself, if you're living someone else's version of who you should be, if you're afraid that God couldn't possibly love the real you, let me tell you something. The God who protected me in that prison cell, who sent hardened criminals to cover me with clothes and kindness, who sustained me through torture and humiliation and the loss of everything I thought mattered, that same God loves you exactly as you are. You don't have to change to earn his love. You don't have to fit into anyone else's box to deserve his grace. You just have to have the courage to be honest, to stop hiding, to trust that his love is bigger than human judgment. That's the real miracle of my story. Not that I survived false accusations or prison or public humiliation. The real miracle is that I finally learned to love myself the way God loves me, completely, unconditionally, without reservation. And once you know that kind of love, once you've experienced that kind of freedom, nothing else can ever hold you captive again. Sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't about being delivered from your circumstances. Sometimes it's about being delivered through them into the person God always intended you to be. That's what Jesus did for me. He didn't just save my life. He saved my soul from the prison of pretending to be someone else. And if he can do that for me, friend, he can do it for you too. But I need to tell you about the deepest part of this journey. The part that almost broke me more than the prison, more than the torture, more than the false accusations. I need to tell you about the silence of God. You see, before all this happened, I had what some people might call a peculiar relationship with the divine. It wasn't the formal religious kind of faith you see in most churches. I had what I can only describe as an ongoing conversation with God. Signs and confirmations that felt as real as talking to a friend sitting next to me. Everywhere I went, the same thing would happen. It was like a signature from heaven, a way God would let me know he was pleased with what I was doing. I'd pray about a decision, and within hours there would be some unmistakable sign that I was on the right path. It became so consistent that I started to depend on it, to expect it. When I was struggling with a difficult choice, I'd say, "God, if this is what you want me to do, let it rain tomorrow." And it would rain. When I needed encouragement, I'd ask for a specific sign, and it would appear exactly as I'd requested. Some people might call that fanaticism, but it was real for me. It was the foundation of everything I believed about my relationship with God. Then came those 3.5 years of hell, and God went completely silent. I'm talking about absolute crushing silence. The kind of silence that makes you question everything you've ever believed about the nature of divine love. I would get down on my knees and beg, literally beg, for just a spark, just a whisper, just the smallest sign that he was still there. "Please," I'd pray, "if it's going to rain tomorrow, let me know you're listening. If the sun shines, let me know you haven't abandoned me." And you know what would happen? If I asked for rain, we'd have 7 straight days of blazing sunshine. If I asked for just one piece of good news in a week, that would be the week Sarah filed 3 new motions against me. When another news outlet would pick up the story, when another batch of death threats would arrive. It was like the universe was actively working against me. Like every prayer I offered was being answered in exactly the opposite way I'd requested. I remember one particularly dark night, sitting in that tiny apartment, having just read another court filing where Sarah was demanding my immediate imprisonment. I looked up at the ceiling and said, "God, I am so disappointed in you. I am so angry and so confused and so tired of this silence. What is truth? What is lies? What kind of love is this that you claim to have for me?" And then I said something that surprised even me. "I'm so stubborn and so hurt that I'm going to keep talking to you even though you won't talk back. I'm going to keep believing even though you've given me every reason to stop. I don't even know why, but I can't seem to walk away from you, even when you've apparently walked away from me." That was the moment I realized something profound about the nature of faith. Faith isn't believing when you have all the answers and all the signs and all the confirmations. Faith is continuing to believe when you have nothing but questions, when the silence is deafening, when everything around you suggests that you're wrong about everything you've built your life on. Faith is for when you don't have answers. Because if you knew everything, if you could see the whole picture, if you understood God's plan completely, you wouldn't need faith at all. You'd just have knowledge. But in the mystery, in the uncertainty, in the apparent absence of divine intervention, that's where faith either dies or becomes something deeper and stronger than it's ever been before. During those silent years, I also found myself wrestling with questions about Jesus that I'd never had to confront before. In seminary, it's easy to study Christ as a theological concept, as a set of doctrines and beliefs to be understood intellectually. But when you're suffering, when you're abandoned, when you're crying out for help and hearing nothing back, you start asking different kinds of questions. Is Jesus just a beautiful philosophy, a wise teacher whose words have been passed down through the centuries? Is he an idea that people use to make sense of suffering and hope? Or is he actually, literally, historically real, in the way that you and I are real? I spent months diving deep into historical research, reading everything I could find about the historical Jesus versus the Jesus of faith. What I discovered was that the evidence for his existence as a real person is actually overwhelming. We have more historical documentation for Jesus than we do for most figures from ancient history. But more than that, when I read the Gospels during those dark years, I saw something I'd never noticed before. I saw a Jesus who wasn't always calm and serene the way he's portrayed in most religious art. I saw someone who experienced the full range of human emotions, including doubt and fear and overwhelming stress. The night before his crucifixion, when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Bible says he began to sweat blood. For years, I thought that was just poetic language. But when I researched it, I learned that there's an actual medical condition called hematidrosis, where extreme stress can cause blood vessels near the skin to rupture, creating the appearance of sweating blood. This wasn't some divine being casually going through the motions of human suffering. This was someone experiencing terror so intense that his body was literally breaking down under the pressure. And what did he pray in that moment? Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. In other words, I don't want to do this. Please, if there's any other way, I don't want to go through with this. That prayer changed everything for me. Here was the Son of God, the perfect man, the one who knew exactly what his mission was and why he was here, and he was saying, I don't want to do this. It wasn't until I read that during my own darkest night that I realized Jesus understood exactly what I was going through. The feeling of being abandoned, of crying out to God and hearing nothing back, of wanting desperately for the suffering to stop. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That wasn't weakness. That was the most human moment in all of Scripture. The moment when even the Son of God felt completely alone. And suddenly I understood that my 3 years of silence from God weren't evidence that he didn't love me. They were evidence that he loved me enough to let me experience the full weight of human suffering, just like Jesus had. Because here's what I realized. If God had answered all my prayers, if he'd rescued me immediately, if he'd made the path easy, I would have remained the same person I was before. Comfortable in my assumptions, confident in my understanding of how the world works, never forced to confront the deeper questions about who I really was. The silence, the suffering, the apparent abandonment, they stripped away everything superficial about my faith and left me with only the essential core. Do I believe in love even when I can't feel it? Do I trust in goodness even when evil seems to be winning? Do I have faith in redemption even when everything around me is falling apart? Those 3 years taught me that God's love isn't always expressed through comfort and ease. Sometimes it's expressed through the very experiences that force us to grow beyond who we were before. When people ask me now about the Bible, about whether it's reliable, about how we can trust scriptures that were compiled by human beings with human agendas, I tell them this. The Bible isn't primarily a rule book for how to live. It's not a collection of moral guidelines or a manual for perfect behavior. The Bible is a love story. From Genesis to Revelation, it's the story of a God who loves humanity so much that he's willing to do whatever it takes to reach us, even if it means taking on human flesh and experiencing human suffering and death. Every story in the Old Testament points forward to Jesus. Every law, every prophecy, every psalm is ultimately about revealing God's character and his determination to rescue us from the things that separate us from him and from each other. When you read it that way, when you see the central message as, God loves you and will never give up on you, then the smaller questions about historical details and cultural practices become secondary. The heart of the message remains constant and clear. And Jesus? Jesus isn't just a historical figure or a philosophical teacher or a religious symbol. He's God's ultimate communication to humanity. He's God saying, you want to know what I'm like? You want to understand my heart? Look at him. When Jesus fed the hungry, healed the sick, defended the outcasts, and challenged the religious authorities who were using their power to hurt people instead of help them, he was showing us who God really is. Not the distant, angry deity of rigid religion, but the loving Father who sees every tear, who understands every struggle, who never stops working to bring healing and restoration to broken lives. That's the Jesus I met in my prison cell. Not through visions or voices or miraculous interventions, but through the inexplicable kindness of hardened criminals who should have wanted to hurt me, but instead protected me. Through the strength I found to keep breathing when everything in me wanted to give up. Through the gradual healing of my heart, even when my circumstances remained impossible. People sometimes ask me if I ever doubted whether God exists during those dark years. The answer is no. I never doubted his existence. What I doubted was his goodness, his care for me personally, his willingness to intervene on my behalf. But here's what I learned. God's goodness isn't measured by whether he prevents suffering. It's measured by how he works through suffering to create something beautiful that couldn't have existed any other way. The man I am today, the understanding I have of grace and forgiveness and authentic love, the ability I have to connect with people who are going through their own impossible circumstances, none of that would exist if I hadn't walked through that valley of the shadow of death. I'm not grateful for the false accusations or the torture or the years of humiliation, but I am grateful for who I became because of how God met me in the middle of it all. And the silence? I understand now that it wasn't really silence. It was God trusting me enough to let me find my own voice, to discover who I was when all the external supports were stripped away, to learn that faith isn't about getting what you want from God, but about becoming who he created you to be. Today, when young people ask me about faith, about how to know if God is real, about why bad things happen to good people, I don't give them easy answers or simple formulas. I tell them that the most important questions in life don't have simple answers. And that's okay. I tell them that doubt isn't the enemy of faith, it's faith's companion. That asking hard questions doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest. That God is big enough to handle your anger and your confusion and your disappointment. Most importantly, I tell them that they don't have to have everything figured out to trust that they're loved beyond measure by a God who knows them completely and accepts them unconditionally. That's the message that got me through prison. That's the truth that sustained me through 3 years of legal battles. That's the foundation that gave me the courage to finally live authentically, even when it meant facing a new wave of persecution. Because when you know, really know, that you're unconditionally loved by the creator of the universe, then human approval becomes optional. When you're secure in your identity as God's beloved child, then other people's opinions lose their power to define you. That's the freedom I found on the other side of my nightmare. Not just freedom from false accusations, but freedom to be exactly who God created me to be, without apology and without compromise. And if that kind of freedom is available to someone like me, someone who lost everything and had to rebuild from scratch, then it's available to anyone who has the courage to trust that love is stronger than fear, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that no darkness can ever completely overcome the light. Sometimes the greatest testimonies aren't about being delivered from difficult circumstances. Sometimes they're about being transformed through them into the person you were always meant to be. That's what Jesus did for me. He didn't just save my reputation, or my freedom, or my life. He saved me from the prison of trying to be someone else's version of perfect. And friend, if you're listening to this, and you're in your own dark valley, if you're crying out to God and hearing only silence, if you're wondering whether love is real, or if hope is just an illusion, let me tell you something. The silence doesn't mean he's not there. The waiting doesn't mean he doesn't care. The struggle doesn't mean you're forgotten. Sometimes God's greatest work happens in the quiet moments, in the spaces between prayers, in the seasons when we can't see his hand, but we choose to trust his heart. And when you come through to the other side, when you look back and see how every broken piece was used to create something beautiful, you'll understand that the silence was never really silence at all. It was the sound of love doing its deepest work, transforming you from the inside out, preparing you for a freedom and a joy that you never could have imagined when you were still trapped in the prison of other people's expectations. That's the real miracle of my story. Not that I survived, but that I was transformed. Not that I was vindicated, but that I was liberated. Not that I found justice, but that I found myself. And if God can do that for me, He can do it for anyone who's brave enough to trust Him with their whole story, even the parts that don't make sense yet. Let me take you back to that moment when everything changed forever. Because this is where Jesus showed up in the most unexpected way. And this is the heart of why I can call this a powerful testimony. When I walked out of that psychiatric facility, broken and confused, I had nothing. No home to go to because of the restraining order. No money, no identification, no possessions. I was literally a man with no past and no future, existing in a terrifying present that made no sense. The secretary who had helped my mother find me lent me a tiny one-bedroom apartment. It was all she could afford, but it was somewhere for me to sleep while we tried to figure out what to do next. That's when someone told me there was an arrest warrant with my name on it. They'd found it by searching the public court records online. Just like that, in black and white, an order for my immediate detention. I called the lawyer who'd been representing both Sarah and me. "I know you're innocent," he said, "but I can't defend you because I was her lawyer too. The ethics board won't allow it. But I'll recommend someone. You can pay him after you win your case." His colleague came to see me and said simply, "We need to turn you in. Running will only make things worse." Here's what had happened. Sarah had walked into a police station and made an accusation. That's it. No investigation, no evidence gathering, no witness interviews. The detective wrote a one-page report to the judge saying I was extremely dangerous and needed to be arrested immediately. The judge signed the warrant without question. No criminal history, no prior arrests. A fixed address, a public schedule, a passport indicating I had no intention of fleeing. None of that mattered. One person's word was enough to destroy a life. So, there I was, walking voluntarily into a police station to surrender myself for a crime I didn't commit, based on an accusation with no supporting evidence whatsoever. The moment I identified myself, they handcuffed my hands and feet. They took my glasses, my shoelaces, anything that could theoretically be used as a weapon. "High security risk," they kept saying, as if this mild-mannered pastor was some kind of terrorist mastermind. They wouldn't even give me utensils to eat with. I had to eat with my hands like an animal. When I asked why, they said, "You could kill someone with a fork." I looked around at these hardened officers, men who'd spent decades dealing with actual criminals, and realized they genuinely saw me as a monster. One accusation had transformed me in their eyes from a human being into a threat that needed to be contained. My lawyer tried to file for immediate release, but it was too late. The transport was already arranged. I was going to Bangu, the maximum security prison where they house the most dangerous criminals in Rio de Janeiro. They loaded me into a police van with about 15 other prisoners. In that cramped metal box, rolling through the streets of Rio with sirens blaring, the conversation was always the same. "What are you in for?" "Didn't pay child support," was the standard answer. Nobody wanted to admit to their real crimes, especially in front of strangers. When they asked me, I said the same thing. Didn't pay child support. Because how do you tell a van full of hardened criminals that you're accused of the worst crime imaginable when you're innocent? How do you explain that your life was destroyed by a lie when nobody would believe you anyway? The whole ride, I kept thinking this had to be temporary. My lawyer would get me out. Someone would realize this was all a terrible mistake. I'd be home by evening. But as we pulled through those massive gates, as I saw the guard towers and razor wire of Bangu prison, I realized this was real. This nightmare was actually happening. They processed me like any other criminal. Stripped me naked, shaved my head, fingerprinted me, photographed me from every angle. And here's something strange. I'd been redheaded my entire life, just like my father and grandfather before me. But the trauma I'd been through was so severe that when they shaved my head and my hair grew back, it was completely different. Dark brown instead of red. Even my body was trying to become someone else. In the intake area, surrounded by guards who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, they asked me a question I didn't understand. "What's your article?" I thought they were asking about grammar. "You mean like definite or indefinite article?" The room went dead silent. Then someone laughed, but not in a friendly way. In prison slang, article means what crime you're charged with. But I had no idea. I was so completely out of my element that I was answering gang questions with grammar lessons. When I didn't give the response they expected, They decided I was being disrespectful. That's when the beating began. They have techniques in prison for punishment that don't leave visible marks. Ways to cause tremendous internal damage without creating evidence of abuse. I won't describe exactly how they do it, but let me just say that you can be seriously injured without anyone being able to prove what happened to you. My face was broken in ways that I'm still trying to repair today. Sometimes one side swells more than the other. I've had to undergo procedures without anesthesia, trying to fix damage that goes all the way to the bone. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what came next. They dragged me, naked and bleeding, to the cell blocks. In Bangu, the corridors are labeled A through F. A is for the least dangerous prisoners. F is for the worst. They threw me into F block. The cell they put me in didn't even have a roof anymore. It was overcrowded with other prisoners. No running water, no proper food, insects everywhere. Unbearable heat during the day and bitter cold at night. The smell was indescribable. As they shoved me through that steel door, the two guards whose faces I can still see clearly said something that made my blood freeze. "Listen up," they announced to the other prisoners. "This one's a child molester. Whoever gets to him first, we won't punish you for it." When I heard that door slam shut behind me, when I realized I was trapped in a room full of violent criminals who'd just been given permission to do whatever they wanted to me, I closed my eyes and said the same words Jesus said on the cross. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." I was certain my life was about to end. I only prayed for one thing. "Please, God, let it be quick." I found a corner, curled up naked in the fetal position, and waited for the inevitable. And then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Something that proves to me beyond any doubt that Jesus was with me in that hell. Instead of violence, I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. When I looked up, expecting to see hatred or cruelty, I saw a man holding out a pair of shorts. Another prisoner handed me a white t-shirt. A third gave me a pair of black flip-flops that I still have to this day, as a reminder of divine protection in the darkest place. For the next 7 days, not one of those men looked me in the eye. Every time they spoke to me, they kept their heads down, their voices respectful, almost reverent. "Friend, I need you to understand what this means. I've researched what happens to people accused of crimes against children when they're thrown into general population. Most don't survive 24 hours. Those who do are tortured, brutalized, often killed within days. But these men, hardened criminals who'd committed every kind of violence you can imagine, they protected me. They fed me when the guards let my food rot before bringing it to me. They watched over me like I was their own family member. This was humanly impossible. There's no explanation for it except divine intervention. The guards tried to break me in every way they could. They wouldn't give me a cup or mug for the coffee they served twice a day. When I asked how I was supposed to drink it, they said, "Open your mouth and we'll pour it in." Scalding hot coffee poured directly into my mouth like I was an animal. I went a full week without coffee, something that might sound trivial but felt like torture to someone who'd loved that simple pleasure his entire life. But the prisoners kept saying, "Eat something. Please, eat something." They had a rule in there. Don't get sick. Because if you got sick, they'd take you to a place that made the regular cells look like luxury hotels. No windows, no light, no toilet, nothing until you either recovered or died. So they protected me from that too. 7 days I spent in that hellish place. 7 days of being treated with inexplicable kindness by people who should have wanted to hurt me. 7 days of experiencing God's protection in the most unexpected way. Meanwhile, outside those walls, my life was being systematically destroyed by a media campaign that had already decided I was guilty. Sarah had taken over all my social media accounts and was posting things designed to make me look like a monster. She found innocent photos of me jogging at night, wearing a hood to stay warm, and claimed they were evidence of satanic rituals. She appeared on television shows with perfect makeup and professional styling, complete with film crews capturing every dramatic moment as she talked about how her life had been destroyed by the monster she'd married. A senator gave her a platform to call for my death or life imprisonment. She was building a fortune on her victim narrative while I sat in a cell, unable to defend myself, unable to tell my side of the story. And here's the cruelest irony of all. Just 2 days after Sarah made her accusations, the child was examined by forensic specialists from the prosecutor's office. These are professionals who do nothing but investigate these kinds of cases. People trained to detect deception and uncover truth. Their report was unambiguous. The child had lied at the mother's request. There was no evidence of any abuse, no physical signs, no psychological indicators. The trained experts concluded that the accusation was completely fabricated. 2 days. While I was being beaten and humiliated in prison, while my face was being broken and my spirit crushed, the evidence of my innocence already existed in an official report, but it didn't matter. The media circus was too profitable. The narrative was too compelling. Truth became secondary to entertainment. After 7 days, my lawyer finally managed to get an emergency hearing. The judge granted habeas corpus, and I was released pending trial. But when I walked out of those prison gates, there was a mob waiting for me. Reporters, cameras, and crowds of people who wanted to tear me apart with their bare hands. My lawyer had hired security guards, because without them, I probably wouldn't have survived my first day of freedom. 3.5 years it took. 3.5 years of legal battles, character assassination, and living under restrictions that made me a prisoner in my own city. 3.5 years of watching Sarah get rich and famous off the lie that destroyed my life. But here's what I want you to understand. In that prison cell, when those hardened criminals protected me for no reason they could explain, Jesus was there. When I should have been beaten to death within hours, but instead was clothed and fed and watched over, Jesus was there. When I found the strength to keep breathing, when everything in me wanted to give up, when I discovered reserves of faith I didn't know I possessed, when I learned to forgive the unforgivable and find peace in the midst of chaos, Jesus was there. He didn't rescue me from the circumstances. He rescued me through them. He didn't spare me from suffering. He transformed me because of it. The man who walked into that prison was trying to be someone else's version of perfect. The man who walked out knew he was loved exactly as he was by a God who sees beyond human categories and labels. This is why I can stand here today and call this a powerful testimony. Not because I was vindicated in court, though I was. Not because my accusers were exposed as liars, though they were. Not because I survived hell and lived to tell about it, though I did. This is a powerful testimony because Jesus showed up in the place where love seemed impossible and made it happen anyway. Because he took the worst thing that ever happened to me and used it to set me free from a lifetime of trying to be someone I wasn't. Today, I live authentically, unapologetically, as the man God created me to be. I've lost most of my religious friends, but I've gained a relationship with Jesus that's deeper and truer than anything I had before. The persecution I face now for living honestly is nothing compared to the prison of pretending to be someone else. The attacks from people who claim to follow Christ only prove how much the world needs the real Jesus, not the narrow, judgmental version that religion often presents. Friend, if you're listening to this and you think your story is too broken, your sins too shameful, your circumstances too impossible for God to work with, let me tell you something. The same Jesus who protected me in that prison cell, who sent violent criminals to be his hands and feet when I needed them most, who sustained me through torture and humiliation and the loss of everything I thought mattered, that same Jesus is with you right now. You don't have to clean up your life to deserve his love. You don't have to pretend to be perfect to earn his grace. You just have to be willing to let him meet you exactly where you are and transform you into who he's always known you could be. That's the real miracle of my story. Not that I survived, but that I was set free. Not that I was vindicated, but that I was transformed. Not that I found justice, but that I found myself. And if God can do that for me, he can do it for anyone who has the courage to trust him with their whole story, even the parts that don't make sense yet. I was arrested for a rape accusation that was completely false, but Jesus used even that injustice to show me a love that's more powerful than human hatred, a grace that's bigger than human judgment, and a freedom that can't be taken away by any court, or any mob, or any lie. That, my friend, is the power of a testimony that's truly worth telling.